Hi everyone, welcome to this Automate Critics session. It's on this book by Henri Schildt called The Data Imperative that was published at Oxford UP. We're going to hear three critics first. First, Jean-Samuel Beuscart is going to talk about the book, then Carolina Aguerre. I hope I'm pronouncing it right. And finally, Maximilian Heimstädt was supposed to be here, but unfortunately he couldn't make it. So he sent a 2-page paper that I'm gonna read. So this will take about 30 to 45 minutes, and then we'll have answers by Henri and a global discussion with the room. So without further ado, Jean-Samuel, if
Thank you. Here is the book for those who want to pass it along. Okay, so first I'd like to thank Elke Schüssler for setting up this session and inviting me to discuss the book, and Henri Schildt for writing it in the first place and sending his copy, and giving me the opportunity of to have the great pleasure to read it. The book is really nicely built. It's neatly written in a very precise style, and all the arguments are easy to follow. It contains several strong claims that I will discuss here, and lots of very telling examples that I will use in my class. I'm a sociologist. I work on the digitization of consumption and markets. So for me, the book was both familiar and exotic. Familiar because it deals with many topics I'm used to deal with. I've even sometimes written or researched about it, and I've read a lot about it, such as the digitization of marketing, the use of consumer data, the use of API for innovation, the relation between APIs and innovation, algorithmic management, and so on. But it was also exotic from a disciplinary point of view, because the book is a management book. It's written in the discipline of management. And its primary audience, as you say explicitly at the beginning of the book, is management scholars and managers. So it was really interesting to see some stories I have read about told from a more manager's point of view, and they are put into an original and very coherent narrative. And I think, indeed, the book deals with many aspects of the contemporary transformation of the firm: data collection, strategy, formal and informal organization, work, the management of people. And one of its great contributions is that it puts together all the things we've been discussing extensively in this network in a new and coherent and original narrative. So in this discussion, I would like to address 3 points. First, I'd like to underline and discuss the added value of this narrative of the data imperative. And then I would like to focus on 2 aspects, the future of work discussion and the digital myopia concept that you bring up at the end of the book, if I still have some time. So let's first discuss the main thesis of the book, that is the narrative of the data imperative that you use, Henri, to account for the contemporary digitization of companies. So to quote you, the subject of the book is the effects of digital technologies on management, organizing, and work in contemporary companies. And you argue that data creates 2 things: a change in the mindset of managers that represents a dramatic change in management and organization of companies. And more precisely, and this is the most original and interesting part, your book focuses on the following mechanism. First, managers have a strong impulse to gather data about all their business processes, and companies try to transform themselves into data companies. This is what you refer to as omniscience. And once represented, all these processes in the company appear in a different light. They appear as suboptimal, they appear as problems to solve, they appear as equations to optimize. And there is this very strong and interesting mechanism because you represent your processes and your environment, and then once represented in data, you are driven to try to optimize it. And this is really the strong claim of the book for me. And this optimization deeply affects, as a consequence, the organizations and the work as we know it. Sorry. So, and the scale of this analysis is quite ambitious because you tell it at one moment. Data here is considered as a generic technology, and the transformation we observe is as important as the one induced by technologies such as the steam engine, electricity, and oil. So really, you have this, to use one of your quotes to underline this, this reasoning, ultimately, this data imperative generates a computer engineering view of the world as a system to be optimized. And it comes with a new mindset where, I quote again, customers, employees, services, and the various business processes connecting them are cast as elements of a system to be represented and then optimized, reinvented, and automated. It made me think of another book that was also published in 2020 that underlines the same kind of process when there is a strong interaction, a dynamic between representing the world in data and then optimizing and then representing and then optimizing. And this is, hello. This is this book by Sinan Aral. I don't know if you've heard about it. So he's the professor and head of the MIT Media Lab. And he published this book. It's mainly about social platforms, but it describes the same kind of loop when other platforms start representing their activity through data and then are led to optimize it and represent the result of the optimization and then are led to optimize it again and so on. And it creates this loop that is kind of similar to what you organize, to what we describe in the book. And I think it's kind of interesting that these two books were published in 2020, and it gives us an idea that we are starting to have good and satisfying narratives about the profound changes that our societies are focusing on, with satisfying stories and satisfying ways to address them. So this thesis is strong, and it's a very efficient narrative. It's quite useful to understand the dynamics of this evolution. And I found it quite convincing because also of its simplicity, and because compared to other existing accounts of the contemporary transformations of the firm due to digital data, such as AI automation or surveillance capitalism, it does not imply that companies have a grand plan to get total control of their environment or to extract sub-profit in every manner. Because this process that you describe is much more progressive and incremental and step-to-step and self-fulfilling. So I have a few questions about this, the agency in this data imperative. The first book is that the book does not give many concrete illustrations of the mindset that has changed among the managers. That means you show us how it ultimately transformed the organizations, but not really precisely how the mindset manifests itself in the discourses of the managers, in their negotiation, in their ideology, etc. So I was wondering whether you could give us some examples, even though we know as social scientists that it's very difficult to empirically illustrate a mindset. My second point is what is exactly the fuel of this movement, or why, in the first place, do managers do it? Why do they start going in this loop? And is it because of efficiency or because of ideology? I mean, to make my point clear, you take the example of Uber, and you say it succeeded in the first place thanks to its matching algorithm and to the efficiency of its data processing. But we could discuss this, and we could argue that among the many elements that made Uber, maybe data efficiency is not the most explanatory, and rather the building of a new transportation offer available directly to consumers that circumvents all the existing regulation and the aggressive lobbying that has been much more and more documented and so on. So the question here is the data imperative important as an efficiency factor, because companies who do it succeed and companies who do it do not succeed, or as an ideology that is, in the case of Uber, data and the fact of presenting itself as a data company tend of fuels the circumventing and all the market story made by Uber to circumvent all the regulations. Sorry about that. And third point about this first point is that at some moment I was wondering whether you don't put too much transformation on the train of this data imperative explanation. Or to say it otherwise, maybe all the transformation of private organizations that are discussed in the book are not primarily fueled by the data imperative, or at least this is something I would like to discuss. And this is especially true for chapter 4 and 5, which deal respectively with modularity of the products and organization and agility of the firm. And here I was not sure that the evolutions you described started with the datafication process, with the datafication of the companies. And for example, as far as modularity is concerned, the reflection about the modularity of digital products dates back to the early 2000s, with questions about the articulation between openness and power and the bargaining power it gives. And most of the literature you quote indeed dates from this period, such as Chesbrough on open innovation. So maybe it started with other driving factors. And the same is for agility and the reorganization of firms as a team of teams. Here again, the rise of the agility paradigm is not sure. I'm not sure it's strongly linked to the data imperative, but maybe it's fueled by it afterwards. But rather to a more general need for reactivity in more rapidly changing markets, more consumer-oriented market, as you mentioned it at one moment. And here, this evolution would start in the 90s rather than today. But okay, this is something I'd like to discuss. You tell me, like 3 minutes? Okay. The second important point that I would like to discuss is which is for me the other major contribution of the book is the theory of the articulation between human work and algorithms. First, I was really struck by your statement, kind of your starting point, about the difficulty to articulate human tasks and machine tasks. And you argue that it's easier to articulate human with humans and machines with machines. And I'm not sure to what extent this is universally true, and maybe we should have some insight from cognitive psychology or economics and so on, but it's really heuristic and very convincing as a starting point. And second, the typology of the articulations between human work and algorithmic work is very enlightening. I just display it here for the audience who hasn't read the book yet. And so you have two dimensions. One distinguishes between the human or the algorithm controls the task, and the other dimension differentiates between human and algorithms do the same tasks or do complementary tasks. And that gives us 4 different cases of articulation between human work and algorithmic work. And to say it quickly, the upper part of the graph is the optimistic part, and the lower part of the graph is a pessimistic part. So in the few minutes I have, okay, and then you describe very convincingly the dynamics of the evolution of this articulation. And especially you are very convincing in underlining all the economic incentives that tends to drive no, this one, to drive us downwards on your graph, if you agree with my interpretation. And so you saw that that since it's difficult for algorithms and humans to articulate, it's always easier, if possible, to simplify the human tasks rather than changing the algorithms. Because on the one side, lower complexity means that workers are easier to control, easier to recruit, easier to bargain with, easier to replace. And you show all the economics incentives of the creators of these technologies to put the value in the technology, all the Silicon Valley actors, rather than in the articulation with human work. So it's really enlightening, and I encourage all of you to read this chapter 6. So here, my question is rather predictably from a sociologist, is about the resistance to this process of job impoverishment. I guess you have thought about it because you also work on in groups about the future of work and so on. So I guess you may know about sociological work on this question, such as the work by Angèle Christin, for example, comparing the relative power of judges and journalists to resist the algorithmization of the organization of their work, or this survey made by Angèle Christin and her colleagues about all the the research about the algorithmization on work, and they try in a kind of an optimistic take in this survey to also underline on the resistance process. So I was wondering whether you had thought about it and whether you think resistance is possible, and where it lies. Does it rely in collective action, in regulation, in etc. And can we in any matter resist this impoverishment process? Oh, in 1 minute then, I will go to my last point, that is about I like very much chapter 7, I guess, which is about the optimization traps and digital myopia. And I think these are very important concepts. And for me, it almost got a little late in the book, because when reading the previous chapters, the devil's advocate in me was always saying, yeah, but often data doesn't work, data is blurry, data is difficult to use, data is incorrect. I've been working on digital marketing, and I know that like some 50% of the data circulating in the digital advertising machine is false or almost unusable. And people and all the actors kind of deal with it. So indeed, underlining these limitations of the data through this very nice concept of digital myopia seems very important and very relevant. And here, just 2 questions to finish. So, do you have examples of optimization traps or digital myopia that would have led company to a failure? Of the example also of companies that failed because their data failed representing what is important for them at this moment on their market. And furthermore, do you think that this digital myopia could counterbalance the trend towards the algorithmization of work? That is, you know, in the competition on the market, some companies may be more successful because they would not optimize some of their process and leave it to humans to who process information differently, and that would be a competitive advantage in the cases of the limited data. So to conclude, this is a very good book that I had a great pleasure reading it. It will speak to many audiences. If there are some sociologists in the room and I advise you to read the book. And if you have a limited amount of time, please focus on chapter 2, 6, and 7. That will be the most relevant to our ongoing discussions. And thank you again for the opportunity to discuss such good arguments. I'm looking forward for the discussion.
Hi, good morning, everyone, and thank you again for the opportunity. It's always, great to sort of be able to comment on a book that you have to study and then say, yeah, I'll use it for a coursework. I must say, I don't come from organization studies or business school, and I have a political scientist and background, and I work on the political economy of digital media and digital processes. So my background is slightly different, but I do really like the kind of organizational sociology, behavior, and approaches that can be connected to a lot of what this book actually is addressing. First of all, I must say that I think that for me, I mean, this is a book that I really find it is a wonderful book to use in both undergrad and postgrad courses. I think it is fantastically clear, well written, with solid examples. I mean, I again, when I was reading, I thought, okay, this is a course work that a book that should be included in my courses. And actually, because I will be teaching in a master in organizational science in this second semester for me. So and I'm bringing in, and my always my intention or my original attempts when addressing digitization and its discontents and its and I say discontents because I always have a more of a critical attitude coming from more of a political economy perspective. I really want to emphasize the meso approach of the book. So it embeds a narrative around the macro and the micro. I mean, the impact on individuals, but the focus on the meso, the organizational focus there, I think analytically it is very powerful. It is very powerful for students in many of the relevant social sciences and sociology that I think goes beyond also the original focus of this book that is centered in management and business students and scholars, right? So I think that is really something that is to be relevantly highlighted as something that is a very explicit contribution of the overall volume. So. What does, I mean, Jean-Samuel has already kind of commented on so many things that I don't want to repeat, and myself and Henri will also elaborate further. But I mean, what is this book about? Okay, so this book, and I'm quoting, it investigates the effects of digital technologies on management, organizing, and work. But it does so not by just reflecting on these technologies and which are data-driven, of course, and it also does it by creating this this bridge, which you can clearly connect it with Jean-Samuel's intervention before, with the development of a framework that is consolidated in the second chapter, and a second part of the book, which I find is very distinctive and which brings in the critical perspective, which I really liked and which came at the end. And I don't know, I was thinking the writing process and the tensions that you must have had with the publishers, because the primary audience for this book is management students and scholars. And then you have to be kind of bring in the innovation, the creative thinking, say, okay, I'm going to bring in the creative approaches to why the data imperative is so relevant in organization and management studies. But it does connect it very nicely at the end. If you stay in chapter 2 or 3, then you might just feel, okay, but all the dystopian issues that are happening in the workplace through data-driven technologies and what they entail, they should never be cut off short in the first or the chapter 2 or chapter 3. You should definitely go to the end, because that's where I think that Henri, and also looking at his work in perspective, is also engaging with this kind of broader systemic challenges that these technologies, data-based technologies and data-driven technologies are bringing in. I also think that a major contribution of this work is connected with making it very understandable, the process of digitization without this kind of historical approaches around the computer, evolution and Moore's law and a lot of what in social sciences courses around digitization, it takes ages to develop. It brings in squarely, okay, we are in a data-driven economy, in a data-driven society, and then it brings in how different technologies and operating systems and the concepts that are used in lower level infrastructures of telecommunications and communication technologies such as modularity, but connected to the meso level, once again, to the organizational setting where the decisions are taken by managers on what kind of interoperability will these managers engage with in their development of the use of data connected to the data they control, but to data they might access from outside, and also to the data ecosystem at large that is largely governed globally by very powerful big tech players, which are data players by and large. And so it's also relevant that the book has a chapter on artificial intelligence as one of these key driving technologies and in this context. I have so many notes, but I don't want to repeat some. There is, if I have to say, I mean, something about, like, and I'm a professor in a university in Uruguay, and I lived for many years in Argentina. So, I mean, coming from a South American context, because I don't want to say the global South, which is extremely diverse, and I think of the examples that are being used in the book, and I know that the research and the fieldwork were mainly in firms based in Finland, the UK, and the United States. But I think that one of the points to think about with such a provocation and of the data imperative is for SMEs, and not just in the developing world at large. It's what does this mean for the smaller and medium enterprises that in the developing world comprise kind of the large majority and the bulk of organizations that employ people, not the big corporations, but the smaller ones. So what does this mean? What does this data imperative mean for the smaller firms, and not just in developing countries, but more globally? And I think this issue connects greatly with the last chapters of the book and the tensions that these technologies and these processes engage, because they are magnified in the cases of the smaller firms all over the world. And I think this is something to look forward to and to engage in the avenues that can be thought and retaken from such a volume for future thinking, future studies, and future contributions. And I mean, I'm already over like 10 minutes, but I have so many scattered comments in my notes here. But what the final comment I would really like to bring in is in the book there's a, and I mentioned it already. There's and Henri explicitly underscores the creative thinking that he puts forward in the framework. And I really think that the framework is very relevant in bringing in some kind of Habermasian kind of knowledge provocation. I mean, this theological approach at this conceptual undertaking of managers and management in general with data. And I think that's a very interesting and relevant provocation, considering the power of the private sector, and not just big tech in general, but the power of firms and the power of managerial thought in shaping what is valuable, what is positive, and what is relevant for society these days. And then as I already said, I think the critical approaches and the critical dilemmas that need to be brought in to this kind of managerial status quo that transpires across managerial classes and elites all over the world who are running these firms under these premises of the data imperative and digitization and digital transformation, which is another concept that this work brings in, and which is, I must say, of course, and you are all very much aware, a key driver of some of the organizational change literature happening these days with and through data and ICTs. I think that this connection between the creative approach of the framework and the critical stances that the last chapters are bringing in are again, the bridges that should be kind of considered in one of the most kind of relevant ways in how this work brings forward to an audience that would not digest very lightly a critical book engaging in how managerial thinking has this kind of very selfish and narrow-minded approach to why and how data should be used for providing better managing decisions. And so the notion of efficiency that Jean Samuel was mentioning earlier, and it is contested in this kind of approaches and the framework provided by the data imperative. So for me, it was, again, like a wonderful exercise. I thank you, Henri, for writing the book and for the opportunity, and thanks for listening.
Thank you. So I'm gonna speak for Maximilian Heimstädt, who sent 2-page documents. So here are his words. I came across Henri Schildt's work for the first time as a PhD student. Back then, I was very interested in the notion of open data. And although I was convinced about the relevance of this phenomenon, most social scientists that I pitched my project to considered the topic rather obscure and technical. But then, one lucky day, I found this wonderful paper by Henri and his co-author, Marcus Berkman. In the paper, they discussed open data as a technology that is not powerful in itself, but that becomes consequential when it gets organized and managed. At the heart of his book, The Data Imperative, I found a similar argument, but on a much larger scale and for a different audience. The main message of this book is, in my words, that the digital transformation is not determined by a set of technologies, but that this transformation requires managerial skill. This social material observation sounds familiar to an academic audience like this one, but Schildt's target audience is another one. He argues that practitioner-oriented books mostly provide technology-centric and deterministic accounts of digital transformation. This is what he positioned his book against. The data imperative is many things at once. It is a collection of chapters on the most prevalent topic around digitalization, such as strategy making, organizational design, algorithmic control, human-AI coordination. It is an entrance point into some classical concepts of organization theory, routines, modularity, authority, just to name a few. It is a summary of some very recent and outstanding studies on digitalization in organization, and a vista into Henri Schildt's diverse empirical projects on digital transformation. Because the topics are so wide-ranging, but my time here is limited, I focus on one issue that demands further discussion. It is the core concept of the book, the data imperative. The author describes the data imperative as, I quote, a normative mindset that pushes managers to prioritize the digital over the humans. I quote, digital data floats over human observations, algorithms over human intuitions, and smart automation over human work, end of quote. The author breaks down this mindset into two, and I quote again, complementary and mutually reinforcing ideals, end of quote. The pursuit of omniscience, seeing and knowing everything, first, and the pursuit of omnipotence, controlling everything, second. In short, the author argues that it is not technology itself that drives the digital transformation, but the ideas, hopes, and expectations that technology creates in the mind of managers. At this point, an annoying question from the standard repertoire of Reviewer 2 comes to mind. The managerial desire to use numbers to exert control. How is that new? And familiar with the Reviewer 2, Schildt, of course, has anticipated this question and briefly discusses what he sees as the main differences between Taylor's scientific management on the one hand and the data imperative on the other hand. For example, a static versus a dynamic notion of managerial control. But I'm not fully convinced, while I'm not fully convinced by the justification, I will not go into it deeper, but accept it for now because it leads me to another more important question. Looking backwards, we know that the Taylorist mindset had substantially changed the way organizations work. In many cases, not to the better, at least for those on the shop floor. Managerial mindsets have real-world consequences. So if we accept the premise that the data imperative is a radically new type of managerial mindset, should we, as management and organization scholars, observe its real-world consequences from a distance, or take a more active and normative role in shaping it? My impression is that the author had this question in mind as well when writing the book, but eventually avoided taking a clear position here. At times, he seems to distance himself from the data imperative when he talks about managers who find it morally suspect, irresponsible, and reckless not to use all the data that one can find. Here, I sense a certain critique of data centrism and technology evangelism. However, at other times, the author seems to turn around and advocate the data imperative mindset. I quote again, I argue that digital transformation requires a broader embrace of managerial ideals that place data at the center in developing and organizing businesses. Summing up, the book manages to shift some responsibility for the digital transformation of organizations into the minds and hands of managers, but it could have taken one step further, not only diagnosing the importance of this new managerial mindset, but showing that this mindset is not a deterministic force, but open for scrutiny and reconfiguration itself. Thank you for your attention. So,
You've been a great Maximilian.
so Henri,
I think I left my bottle.
Maybe you.
Yes.
You have about 20 minutes.
Okay. Thank you so much to all three of you and to Maximilian, who is suffering from COVID somewhere in Germany. So thanks a lot. This is really like. The book came out in the middle of the pandemic, and I was supposed to give us talks, at various places, which never then happened in person. So this is really nice to organize this session, and it was really nice hearing about your reactions, and also I have to say I was smiling because of these kind of tenses. Who is the book written to? I did study sociology, and I wanted to write like a sociological book. And who is this? I don't remember. One of the ASA former presidents had this concept of public sociology, which is neither theoretical nor critical, but like... sorry? Yeah, exactly. And that was in my mind when I wrote the book, so I wanted to kind of get away from the practice and prescriptions and try to provide a more analytical view of what is actually happening with digitalization. And also I was smiling with this normative question of the normative perspective that Carolina and then Maximilian in particular brought up, that for me, teaching often people who want to actually get a career in the industry, do well, I wanted to maintain a certain sense of neutrality. And it's very funny that some of the students read the book and say and come away, with this idea that, okay, I say it's a normative standpoint, but they think that they need to adopt it. They need to really embrace this way of thinking, and this is like proper way of approaching management and organizing. And others come away with a much more critical view of like contrasting the datafication, or whatever we want to call it, the data imperative, with this financialization of companies and the economy, where we saw all the management buyouts and layoffs that came from applying the finance mindset very strongly to companies. So if I try to address the points, I'm not sure I'm going to be able to do all of that, but I liked your points very much. You brought up this question of how is this mindset visible in managers, and I have to say there's not enough empirical material in the book. I've been doing quite a bit of interviews in the different companies, and I have one article and this one study that I will hopefully publish next year that looks very much then in the interviews. But there is very much present this idea that if we don't have data, we don't know things. I have done a big study at an airline now. There's only one in Finland, so you'll figure out which one it is. But anonymous airline, and there's like this one manager says that yes, we have these people tell about the social media, but if they don't have data about like concrete data and models, we can't take those information into account. So we just ignore what they say. And once you get into this mindset that you need to make decisions with data, if you don't have data, things just don't count. And many companies, you have this ideal of system level optimization, like everything should be interconnected. So like when somebody, so one thing, for example, in this airline case is that we need to create automatic algorithm that designs the schedules of our flight crews and pilots, because when we are planning the routes, it is suboptimal because we can't immediately know, do these people need to stay overnight in Miami and how much it will cost, and this kind of there's some kind of like colonialization by data, that everything has to be brought under algorithms and data, because if there are these humans who plan the shifts for our pilots, it's suboptimal. It's like we lose money, or it's not done in a proper way, right? So it's not just to save costs that we need to replace these people with algorithms, but it's just the kind of the whole
mantra.
Yeah, the mantra and this kind of idea that what we are building is not an organization for professionals to exert their expertise, but we are building a machine that sells the tickets and flies the planes and adapts the network, and like this. I think Maximilian pointed out this question of what's different from scientific management, but I think it's like one whole kind of decimal point bigger, the desire for control. And so why do they digitalize? Is it efficiency or is it ideology? And I would say that maybe it doesn't come in this book, but I see the whole question of efficiency as part of the ideology. I mean, you have an ideology that defines what is rational. So I don't take stance in this, because I don't think it's like in institutional theory, the old neo-institutional theory, we had technical reasons and institutional or ceremonial reasons. But I think it's the institutionalized ideology of data-driven management that defines what is rational and technical. And it's very difficult to kind of resist, and you asked examples of optimization traps, and I think one of the most powerful and most well-run data-driven companies, Facebook is a very good example, right? They tried to optimize the number of minutes people spend on Facebook so that it would, like that their algorithms were designed to increase the amount of time everyone spends on Facebook. And it was 2018, I think they admitted that this is actually optimizing it. I think it was 60 minutes on average people were spending. Optimizing this actually led to mental health issues and people dropping out and deleting their Facebook accounts. So they got into this mindset that this is the outcome variable and ignored for a long time all these kind of longer term impacts, because the one thing that mattered is that next week people will spend even more minutes on Facebook. And and I think having studied, I really, these companies, especially now the airline after the COVID, there is a lot of value in maintaining human control and maintaining human expertise. And this is, of course, something that's been studied with automation for at least 50 years, that when you increase automation, you decrease expertise. And it's really challenging now in this economy, and I think especially in Europe, that there's this strong economic incentive to automate things and then to get rid of the expensive people. And then the companies become really dumb. And in the end, if the context changes, then the organizational changes will have to be made by all the software providers, because how we run the company, how you run a university these days is partially driven by IT systems. Well, not so much yet, but increasingly. And and then the last point I'm going to address about Sean Samuel, I don't know how to pronounce your name properly, but is the role of this datafication or data imperative in actually driving the modularity, driving the agility trends. And I'm gonna double down. I mean, it's a bit like silly to have one idea and then write it, but I think there's a very strong connection to this kind of representing everything with data that allows you to coordinate things with data. So if you rely on human expertise, you need to coordinate things among humans, right? And that creates that creates issues, right? So last century, all the organizations were almost hierarchical, and the idea was that you have individuals who can specialize into one thing, and then you have well-designed processes that coordinate between people. That's how you build cars, right? But it's really this datafication that all the tasks create and consume digital data that you can modularize activities that couldn't be modular before. Like you can outsource digital marketing. Facebook can decide who sees the ads of your company or which products are advertised to which people. And the data drives modularity, and this modularization drives new ways of organizing. That, of course, for me as an organizational scholar, are very, very interesting and important. But okay. I'll get to the point about resistance soon. So thank you, Carolina, for lots of really nice comments, and I was really happy to hear that you think that this book fits your teaching, because that's what I was actually thinking about. That I'm writing in a way a sociological book, although one that seems to is maybe useful for also people who actually want to go in the world and work with this. And I like your observation or argument that we need the meso perspective, and I really believe in that. And as was said, you know, the managers, the private sector has the power, you said, to set the tone, to kind of determine the discourse. And this way of thinking about AI is very much embedded in the practices. So I very much believe that these ideologies or rationalities are very strongly embedded in whatever infrastructure companies invest in what are the best practices of doing things. And whatever shape AI will take is really, and we see that also in privacy legislation, like the discourse on privacy is determined very much by the practices of leading large companies. So we do need to look into the organizations. We need to look at this kind of ideologies and belief systems that let the private sector push a certain view of what work is, how AI should be governed, what is the role of government in all of this. And I think we face a real tension, especially in Europe, that we are in trouble if we don't digitalize, right? I mean, we can be left behind, we become like an outdoors museum, that's the argument. And then in the end, we have this real kind of challenges that if we just follow the US and just like imitate, the society will not look the same, and we will end up with the same level of inequality in the worst case. I really loved your point about developing countries. I think there is a real, with this modularization, there's a real danger that companies will be controlled by Silicon Valley everywhere around the world. Already we see in the Western world, like how is agriculture changing with data. So you have this kind of massive de-skilling because there are companies like Siemens or IBM or Airbus even who want to use satellite data, predictive AI models to tell, you know, in this field you know, I don't know the vocabulary for farming in English, but anyhow, you know, this is the date you need to put in the seeds, and this is how much you use pesticides and when you water, and the farmer becomes just like a dummy who reads from the mobile phone what needs to be done, right? And in the worst case scenario, if the AI is really powerful, the logical kind of if nothing is done, the logical kind of economic rationality will at some point be that Google or someone will just, you know, make all the decisions for these SMEs, and their stuff will be sold on some platforms owned by the Chinese, and this is, yeah, but like it's the Uberization, right? If you go to Argentina or Uruguay, the Uber driver is told by a computer in California where to drive and how much the trip costs. Okay, and finally, I want to leave some time for people for questions and comments and critique if somebody has read it. So, in Maximilian's point, I really like his observation or characterization that the data and algorithms are just resources in a way, that their importance is based on how they are mobilized by new organizing, new ways of managing things. And he talks about like where does this mindset come from, and is it new? And I would say that this data imperative as a normative mindset, of course, has its roots in operations research. We have had things like logistics have been subject to data-driven optimization since the Second World War. But I think it's important to recognize that these kind of intentions and motives and ways of thinking are also materially embedded, and we can see how the thinking changes because of the data companies have. So I can tell from the airline, like one example is that they were able to, after a long time, able to combine data from operations side of the business, which is flying the planes, and then the commerce side of the business. And there are things like like things that they didn't think they would see as optimization problems. But once you have the digital infrastructure, they appear in new light. So they used to have this rule of thumb that when you have congestion at the airport, the biggest planes should leave first. So like you have 10 planes waiting, some of them will be late. So the small planes will wait and the people will be late, the big planes leave first. And now they have, they're collaborating with Lufthansa and they have this new piece of software that calculates for every flight exactly how many euros it costs for every minute it leaves late. Because if somebody is if somebody misses the connecting flight, that creates costs. If somebody is more than 3 hours late, according to EU rules, you have to pay 800 euros. So ideally, nobody is more than, it's fine if they are 2.5 hours late. So this appears as an optimization problem, right? And then you can see that there's one optimum order in which the planes should leave the airport. And this kind of mindset or ideology is I think it's inappropriate to say colonizing, but maybe I can use that word. It's kind of staking out more ground, more and more things that used to be decided by some human who worked in the operations control for 15 years and who makes judgments that should be replaced by a piece of software developed by or in Germany or in the US. So yeah, I think this normative mindset has been there, but it's also there's an opening, right? Okay, I think I took all my time, or hopefully not too much. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Maybe we should open the floor to the public, so I'm going to circulate this if someone wants to ask questions.
Yeah, thanks very much for the presentation and the comments. So I haven't read the book yet, so if my questions are solved by reading it, then you just give me some more input, and then I think I'm going to read it. I think that's definitely, you accomplished that. I'm working on manufacturing mostly, and digitalization in manufacturing, so I would be very curious how much you focus on that, or how much insight you have there, because what I know from my own research is that it works quite differently, and that also the question of collecting data, sharing data to actually develop some or use services that could make manufacturing more efficient is a very sensitive topic, and at least for German SMEs and all that, it's still very in baby shoes, I would say. So maybe a question of how, it sounds like a very general argument you make, and if you look a bit more into the nuances, maybe what you see there. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Are we collecting first questions and then I'll write down. Yeah. Okay.
Well, you could answer that.
Yeah, we have time, so you can answer.
Okay, great. Okay, so thanks a lot for the question. Yeah, so I have looked, and Finland is very manufacturing-focused country. I mean, we have mostly business-to-business industry, so I've talked a lot about that. I would say that this is where the Internet of Things has really come into play, that you have, I don't think the digital twin is maybe the best concept to capture actually what's happening, but we have this representations of the processes and machinery through this Internet of Things already quite a bit. What I'm seeing is I would emphasize then the organization part of the book, that in a way the organizational structures and culture are not used to this kind of use of digital data. And it has taken quite a bit of time to shift away from this kind of running the business to optimizing it with data. And it has implications on transparency, openness of the companies, completely different kind of relationship with suppliers and other companies. So I think in manufacturing there's a slow process of like becoming more open and inviting companies to like leverage the data and analyze the data. It's difficult to generalize here, but I see this very much. The framework is intended to be generic, and many of the examples are, some of the most kind of vivid examples are from services, because there you're controlling humans, right? It's somehow much more sociologically interesting than controlling machines, but it's definitely happening. And I see this kind of normative change being very big in how you organize the manufacturing companies. Please.
Hi, thank you so much for the book. So my name is Wen Juan. I'm from Hong Kong University of Science and Technology. So I also do work on digital economy. And I was curious how you think about pervasive this kind of like data imperative are expanding into different sectors and different organizations, because I sort of feel like this is it's a growing fashion in some way among this kind of big tech company and big corporations. They are embracing this. But I feel like it's quite hard for that to actually infiltrating into smaller, enterprise. It seems like even though they collect the data, it's not going to be a lot of data, or they have all this data, went all the way to collect those data as a, thinking about they are the new managers that are embracing this, but they're not going to really use that. So not all the data will be used. As I think you also mentioned about the digital marketing, like half of the data actually useless. They just store there. So do you think that this is really a temporary thing? Like we are seeing this because this new digital economy is booming and this fashionable and for those managers to thinking really a data weight, or this is it's gonna fundamentally change how those organizations organize. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, that's a very good question. I guess the easiest way out of this question would be to compare it to kind of these other changes in management, like financialization, or like this kind of really corporate finance mindset that came in the 60s, 70s to companies, and it didn't reach all the small, medium-sized, but I would say that it has, if you look at how small, medium-sized companies are organized and managed today, it's definitely very different from what it was in the 60s, with this management accounting kind of tool. So I think the same will happen. One big change is the disintegration of value chains, or disaggregation of companies, and this, I think, will be increasingly the case, that if you're a small producer, you will operate on Amazon, for example, or some other platforms, Alibaba or whatnot, and that will shape some of the activities that used to be done inside your company by humans will be done by algorithms in other companies. So it will at least shape the organizing and organizations in that way. We will probably at some point have a system where all the recruiting will be done by some kind of AI-based recruiting platforms, right? That the managers will think it's no longer sensible for them to read through 50 CVs, and then it kind of seeps in from different sides. Does that make sense?
Yes, but also I saw quite a bit of resistance.
Yeah.
Towards that.
Yeah. I think the resistance is something I should have talked about. I'm not super optimistic, to be honest. I mean, if you look at the outsourcing, offshoring, sure there was resistance that we need to keep manufacturing in Europe and we need to keep the expertise, but it was striking. I was talking about AI with some people in accounting, and they say that, oh, that already happened 15 years ago. I mean, we had full floors of people whose jobs were automated away by algorithms. And in the early 90s, if you had a maternity leave, you could get a part-time job in an accounting firm. But today, all those part-time job things are automated, and what we really need are people who work like 40 to 60 hours a week, you know, at the customer interface, who are always reachable. So yeah, I hope the resistance works, but I'm not super optimistic.
Hi. Okay. I will use it.
Sorry.
So I found this. I've only been skimming this book. I definitely need to do a deeper read. But it's definitely an interesting read. I studied management. I was a management consultant at huge digitalization projects in Latin America. And now I'm studying a critical view of development at the International Institute of Social Studies in The Hague. And my research focuses on the digitalization of agriculture. So I found really interesting what you were saying about this Silicon Valley takeover of agriculture. And really, it's insane how it's happening. And I was wondering, because digitalization in agriculture has been there for 40 years. It started in the 80s in the US, and it's an interesting comparison when you manage plants with algorithms and data, and then you move to managing humans with this. And I think there's an interesting comparison there of how the smaller farms don't really need this. This kind of management appears because farmers in the US are managing too huge of a land, so a farmer cannot see the crops that are far away. And if you take this to organizations with humans, really, it makes sense for huge firms, but does it make sense for smaller firms? All the research out there will tell you that this doesn't work for small farms, right? Really, smallholders have no use for these technologies, but they still implement them. For whose sake, I'm not sure. And this is a challenge that I see that has been raised about how this imperative for data management is being thrown at small companies. So my question is whether this discourse of digitalization and what you were saying, that it feels kind of silly, or there's a certain guilt of not using data and management in Europe, is just pushed by Silicon Valley players. And you mentioned in your book a lot of challenges that this brings, like less of a bird-eye view or openness to opportunities and adaptability. But it also creates huge opportunities for the Silicon Valley big tech players. Like you will see financialization that they will be able to speculate on the price of land, of the price of commodities. There's a lot of new business opportunities that come with pushing data into rural areas and into small firms and small farms. So I was wondering how you understand this kind of using the discourse of digitalization as a tool for creating these new opportunities for businesses.
Yeah, I think that's very, very, very good observation. And I really don't, when I say it's a normative mindset, I'm not really endorsing it. I think this is a very complex question. One threat is that it also becomes an accepted dogma in the government, right? We saw that with the financialization, that kind of mobility of capital, and these ideas became very much assimilated, especially in some countries, of course. I would still also note that there are actual economic gains to be had from using data. I mean, if we look at one sector that I've been studying a bit now is the grocery segment. And of course, if you don't use all the IT, all the algorithms, you have more waste, you have missed opportunities to sell stuff. Whether that's important or not is another question, but like more inefficient logistics, wasted products, like you need to use the data. You need to somehow, to be competitive, right? You need to optimize. So there are two sides, I think. One is this kind of inevitable economic logic of optimization. The other one is this kind of ideological pushing of this kind of control. And I think this division of labor you've highlighted that of course then the who owns the data has the bargaining power and is able to extract value. So there is this, I don't know, like a digital feudalism where, you know, a few big companies control all the data and have all the AI and the small companies only like work to just sustain themselves. So yeah, that's a very good point. And maybe if I would write another edition of the book, I would maybe dwell more into this macro level issues, but it's not my background, right? I like thinking about it, but I'm not an expert. Yeah.
Okay, thanks a lot for the presentation. I will certainly buy the book. I'm teaching as well on the social and ethical impact of digitalization, so it's a reference that I will incorporate certainly. I wanted to take you into two directions that you just briefly touch on, and I know that's probably not the areas that you are studying right now, but one is, even if we all knew that digitalization basically what does is capturing the know-how of a company that goes to a third party, I was a bit surprised by the level of de-skilling that are happening in these companies. And I'm a bit surprised that they are not aware of this. Perhaps I have never thought about the extent of this de-skilling. I thought that, I have the de-skilling in mind when I think on an Amazon plan, the logistics. But now what you're saying, which is totally true, is that large companies are basically giving away, as we know, the know-how to another party, and that they forget about how to do things in the old fashion. It's like now, I'd say my students, we wouldn't be able to run a supermarket without the internet, because no one knows how to do this. So I thought perhaps you had some ideas of, I don't know if the word is ways of resistance, but what are companies doing to protect this know-how, which goes against the data imperative? Then it's not that an imperative, because I think companies don't want to give away this, so there must be forms to resist this data imperative. So that would be one question or suggestion if you can talk about. The second one, I'm obviously interested as well on the political level, and particularly the role of the European Union and how I think we are more sensitive than, or perhaps less captured by the logics of the Silicon Valley or the equivalent in China. Here, the agenda of these last 2 or 3 years relies a lot on the idea of digitalization with a social phase, with protection, with we have the GDPR and some other laws. The question would be, it's a very broad one, but this tries to defy the data imperative, right? It's not that you are not very optimistic, you are very pessimistic, I would say, on the ways to confront this, because it's an imperative. But I would like to collect your ideas on what is to be done at the political level, because I think it's in the interest, and I think it's in the mindset of the policymakers in Europe, that we don't want to simply be dependent on the US, for instance, on data sets and so on. But
yeah. Thanks a lot. Very good points. I mean, the de-skilling, I think it's, if we think of the offshoring in a way, that was where you move things that are kind of independent of our core knowledge and our core insights and expertise. You can offshore some putting together or, creating some physical stuff. But what's happening with digitalization is that you can move so much information that the very kind of core expertise related tasks can be outsourced. And the de-skilling is a really big issue. I studied, there's a Finnish company called Wärtsilä. They create gas turbines that they sell to power plants. And they are, of course, full of IoT now, so you know exactly how they operate. And the clients are worried because they have expertise on how to optimize the turbines, but all of that knowledge actually can be inferred from the sensors. And Wärtsilä can configure the turbines in the same way in their competitors' power plants, right? So all the knowledge flows with the data to the manufacturer. So some of the companies are resisting and want to keep their data themselves, but that's suboptimal in the long term, right? Because you have this prisoner's dilemma that if most of the companies want to share the data, then it flows and you get better outcomes. Maybe you run the turbine slightly more effectively or something like that. But yeah, there's the dependencies peak, and we have this de-skilling happening not on individual level only, but on organizational level. So you lose the ability to understand the performance when it's outsourced to the manufacturer. And it's difficult. I mean, I saw with the airline case with COVID that they had basically anyone who had arrived during the past 10 years was useless in figuring out how to run the airline because they didn't have the expertise, the knowledge, the concepts when the algorithm stopped working. So it was the employees who were like hired there 15, 20 years ago who still understood stuff about how demand the business class versus tourists, and you know, how do you this kind of tacit knowledge of predicting the demand going forward. And these people then ran the show because they had this human expertise. And it's kind of, if COVID would have happened 5 years later, lots of companies would lack this kind of managerial expertise because everything is being done by algorithms and it's much cheaper, right? And you just fire or they retire, you know, you don't replace the people who retire who have the yeah. And the role of EU in pushing back, I'm not sure. I mean, there are two things, right, how you can look at this. So one thing is this openness and data policies, giving consumers potentially ownership of their data, preventing companies on industry level from you know, monopolizing data. So there's this kind of fairness, openness approach, and then there's the kind of the protections and rights approach. This is really not my area in that sense, but I would think that the openness data policy is kind of like making the playing field more fair and potentially even tilted towards the SMEs in Europe would be the better approach. I think with the rights and protections, there's always this thing that it prevents us from developing things, and then American companies will be able to somehow, you know, push their TikToks and, well, that's Chinese, but, you know, so solutions to us eventually. So, yeah, it's tough. It's tough. I think fighting against the digitalization and trying to stay in the past, if we think of like the media industry, that we would have prevented Facebook and Google from, it can also backfire. I think there's a intertemporal trade-off in terms of slowing things down or speeding things up for our companies.
I've joined the session very much. I'm very much an outsider. I'm a political scientist who works on very different things. But I've really enjoyed the discussion. I've got 3 small questions if I can. The first is, do you find evidence of learning at all about whether things work, about whether things have a sort of negative impact upon internal processes, on management, any of these kind of things? I'd be really interested to hear about that, because technology is, as we know, developing the whole time. There are multiple interaction effects which are unpredictable, and I wondered if organisations have the capacity, managers have the capacity to learn. A second question is about bounded rationality. Okay, so I work in a university, and how can I put this in the most polite way? I don't believe that my managers really know what they're doing when they introduce technologies. And I mean, what it made me think about is, the garbage can, running sort of this kind of analysis of universities and how they're sort of adapting and using data would I think be a really interesting sort of exercise. And I'm just one very small example. I remember the days when your teaching timetable was written out in the hallway. Okay, so if you got lost, if you had a sudden mental fog, all you had to do is go into the hallway and note this. Now, what do you have to do? You have to log in. You have to log in. You have to manoeuvre your way. You have to find it. It's just ridiculous in my view. And again, I mean, I think that institutions are. I don't say it's not only my institutions. And I also think about room allocation, but let's not go there. So, how does bounded rationality sort of feature in your work, and is it time to revisit the garbage can? Is my second question. The third is about sectorization, and I think you said some really interesting things in responses to questions from the floor about distinctions between services and manufacturing. And I was struck by your example of Finnair. Sorry, I shouldn't say that. Of the airline. Sorry about that. I have written a book on aviation, but from a very different kind of perspective. But it strikes me that, in a way, aviation is a really atypical case, because it was dependent upon computer reservation systems a very long time ago. And it's kind of, it seems to me this is a really sort of strong example of how technology. If you wanted to counter dystopianism about data management, this is probably the sector that you'd use it in. But I wondered if I went to a presentation the first day I was here from a guy who was working on air traffic control systems, and the story he told about the de-skilling of the people who watch planes fly through the sky and manoeuvring them, I found was quite terrifying. So my thought is, there's a data imperative, but it's not very easy to resist the dystopianism here. Because, the particular story he told, I'm aware I'm taking a lot of time now, but the particular story he told is how at City Airport in London, there was a control tower that the air traffic controllers used to watch the planes, and they could adapt to different environmental conditions, changes in weather and all that kind of thing, and say turn around or whatever. Now they do this from a room at a distance, miles away actually, but just watching computer screens. And it strikes me. First of all, I won't ever be flying out of London City again. Okay, but it just strikes me that the loss there is really dramatic. And I wondered if this is ever factored in, even into the sort of, is it something that is formally sort of discussed by managers? Is it somewhere that something that just is not seen by companies, or is just ignored by them? Anyway.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Very good questions. I mean, organizational scholars are not very optimistic about organizational learning in general. I mean, some argue that the learning happens by old companies being replaced by new ones often, and we see that also a lot with digitalization, right? That learning is not so easy. It's also, learning is very normative, right? Because you kind of say that the new way of doing things is better than the old way of doing things. And of course, when I look at the retail, if you have less salmon, you need to throw away. That's, I guess, a learning, right? That you learn to optimize your things with data. I was thinking of a university example. Our dean, we were thinking about thinking about the admission criteria for a bachelor's program and thinking like, how do we admit students? And the data imperative has somehow steeped into our dean's mind, because his reaction was, let's look at the historical data, like how do the entry criteria predict the outcomes, like the graduation time, the grade point average. And I don't think he had the starting salary, but like in the business school, actually our certification or like ranking criterion is students' graduation salary. So here kind of the learning would be that we look at what factors predict, you know, what outcomes, and we maximize outcomes. But I think that is more myopia than learning, because like, is that how you really pick people into a bachelor's program? Like, do you want to just pick people who graduate very fast and will go on to earn a lot of money? I think that's a terrible vision of university education. So we do see that learning, but I would really question. From an economics perspective, of course, learning is just productivity, so it's very easy to look at. Yeah, I think the garbage can bounded rationality, there is a bit of that, right? I mean, in this case, isn't the regression model is a solution looking for problem, and admission criterion is a problem looking for solutions. So I think when you have more and more data lying around, and now companies talk about this, what is the, like algorithmic assets, like different kind of algorithms we have developed, customer life cycle value or lifetime value frameworks. So all of this data and algorithms are solutions looking for problems. I very much subscribe to that. But it's slightly different from the 70s garbage can, because they are like solutions that get put into place forever. It's not just a temporary solution to a temporary problem, but it like in this, the problem is which order should the planes leave? And then you have a solution that gets instituted. Or how do we admit students? And then you get a dynamic system where admission criteria will always be adapted so as to best predict the outcomes. And actually, nobody had thought of this. We had a new set of entry criteria, and the share of female students went from 40% to 20%, and that was kind of a catastrophe, right? But nobody had put that up into discussion. Now it's a data point, right? Now we need to adapt the criteria so as to get, you know, a more even gender balance. So it's not a step back from using data. It's like just more and more data gets inputted. Yeah, I think the last point, and now I'm out of time, is that, yeah, airlines are definitely very data-fied. So it is in a sense, I guess it's a trade-off. You can study universities which are completely non-data-fied, or you can study airlines where it's very far along. But yeah, there are lots of industries. Even like the healthcare used to be the laggard, but we see more and more of them now using data in all kinds of stuff, from patient care to scheduling things. They use data to track where the machinery is and stuff like that. Yeah. Thanks.
Thank you very much. So time is up. I think we're going to close here, except if there's, yeah. Thank you very much, Henri. Thank you very much, everyone, for being here. And let's go to lunch and continue the discussion.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thanks.